My name is Dana, and I've been driving delivery trucks for more than 20 years. The story I'm about to share happened about 4 years ago, and it changed my life forever. It was a stormy night, and I was driving my medium-sized delivery truck along a rural highway in northern Pennsylvania. The clock read 3 a.m., and the road was completely deserted. I was heading toward a distribution center to deliver a shipment of electrical supplies. The route was long, and I had about 3 hours left to reach my destination. Out of nowhere, a heavy rainstorm started. The rain fell in sheets, making visibility on the road extremely challenging. But after so many years of driving under all kinds of weather conditions, I had grown used to such situations. Still, I couldn't help feeling frustrated because the downpour was bound to delay my trip. As I navigated through the storm, another unsettling sensation crept in, an inexplicable restlessness that gripped my chest. I couldn't pinpoint what caused it. Perhaps it was the eerie silence on the empty highway or the exhaustion from driving all night. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. To distract myself, I switched on the truck's radio and tuned into a local station playing soft music. It helped a little, but the unease lingered, shadowing every thought. Determined to stay cautious, I slowed down, mindful of the slippery road conditions. A few miles ahead, something unexpected happened. The rain was still coming down hard, and the thick fog made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet in front of me. That's when I noticed headlights, bright and erratic, piercing through the fog. It was a car speeding straight toward me in the opposite lane, veering dangerously close to my truck. By the time I saw it clearly, it was almost too late. Instinctively, I swerved to avoid a collision, but the wet road made it impossible to regain control of my vehicle. My truck skidded wildly before flipping onto its side and careening off the highway. I'll never forget the sensation of weightlessness as the truck spun violently, followed by the deafening crash of metal hitting the ground. When I opened my eyes, everything was a blur. I was lying on the cold, wet ground outside the truck. Pain radiated through my entire body, and I couldn't move my legs. Dazed, I struggled to piece together what had happened. Memories of the headlights, the swerve, and the crash came rushing back. I tried to call for help, but my voice was barely a whisper. Darkness surrounded me, and panic began to set in. As I lay there, fading in and out of consciousness, I heard faint footsteps crunching on the gravel and the sound of an engine idling in the distance. Moments later, two figures emerged, a middle-aged woman and her teenage daughter. They hurried toward me, their flashlights cutting through the rain. The older woman knelt beside me, her voice calm but firm as she reassured me that help was on the way. They called an ambulance and stayed with me, holding my hand and keeping me awake until paramedics arrived. Though I fought to stay conscious, the pain and exhaustion were overwhelming. The last thing I remember before passing out was the sound of sirens growing louder. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by the faint hum of machines and the sterile smell of antiseptics. My head throbbed, and my body felt heavy, as if weighed down by invisible chains. The nurse informed me that I had several broken bones, internal injuries, and a severe concussion. She also told me I was lucky to be alive. The recovery process was grueling. Days turned into weeks, and I remained in the hospital, unable to move without assistance. I was entirely dependent on the nurses and doctors, and I had never felt so helpless. The physical pain was unbearable at times, but even worse was the mental torment. I replayed the accident in my mind repeatedly, questioning what had gone wrong. Then, strange things began happening. At first, I dismissed them as tricks of my exhausted mind. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night and feel like someone was watching me. It was a prickling sensation at the back of my neck, as if unseen eyes were fixed on me. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a side effect of the head injury. But one night, I woke up to see a shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. It was tall and dark, its outline blurry in the dim light. My heart raced as I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure began moving closer, and a cold wave of terror washed over me. I squeezed my eyes shut and silently begged for it to go away. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, the figure was gone. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, I told the nurses what had happened, but they dismissed it as a vivid episode of sleep paralysis, possibly caused by the trauma I'd endured. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real. And over the next few days, the figure appeared more frequently. Sometimes it stood at the window, other times it loomed in the corner of the room. It was always silent, watching. Each encounter left me trembling, unable to explain the eerie presence that seemed to follow me. Determined to find answers, I turned to the internet. Using my phone, I began researching accidents that had occurred along that stretch of highway. What I discovered sent shivers down my spine. There had been numerous reports of accidents, many eerily similar to mine. Drivers claimed they had seen headlights speeding toward them, causing them to lose control of their vehicles. Others described encountering shadowy figures in the road just before their crashes. I became convinced that the figure haunting me was connected to the accident. It wasn't just my imagination. It was something real, something tied to that cursed stretch of road. The woman who had saved me that night, her name was Helen, had left her number with my family. One afternoon, I called her, hoping she might have seen something that would confirm my suspicions. I asked if she had noticed the speeding car that caused my crash. Her answer chilled me. Helen told me she had been driving a short distance behind my truck when she saw it swerve uncontrollably and tip over. But she hadn't seen any other vehicle. She swore that no car had passed by, either before or after the crash. Her words confirmed what I had feared. There had been no car. Whatever I had seen that night wasn't real, or at least, not in the way we understand reality. That same night, the figure appeared again. This time, it didn't linger at a distance. It approached me slowly, its presence as cold as the night of the crash. I was frozen, unable to move or call for help, as it stopped right beside my bed. Then, it did something it hadn't done before. It began to whisper. Its voice was faint and hollow, but I could understand the words. The figure told me it had been a truck driver, just like me. Many years ago, on that very highway, they had been involved in a terrible accident. A car driving on the wrong side of the road had collided head-on with their truck, killing both drivers instantly. The figure's tone wasn't angry or vengeful, it was filled with sorrow. It spoke of the endless nights spent wandering the stretch of highway where it had died, reliving the tragedy over and over. It told me it hadn't intended to harm me but had been drawn to my truck, as if some invisible force compelled it to act out its final moments. Before I could ask anything, the door to my room opened and a nurse entered. The figure vanished, leaving me shaken and unsure of what I had just experienced. The following day, I dove deeper into my research, trying to piece together the figure's story. After hours of searching, I found an old news article from nearly 40 years ago. It detailed a horrific crash on the same stretch of highway. A car, driven by an intoxicated man, had collided head-on with a large truck. Both drivers were killed instantly. The article didn't reveal much about the truck driver, but I knew in my heart it was the same spirit that had visited me. The other driver, whose reckless actions had caused the crash, was likely the reason for the restless hauntings. I felt a deep sense of sadness for both souls, trapped in a loop of pain and tragedy, unable to find peace. That night, the figure didn't return, and I never saw it again. I like to think my acknowledgement of its story helped it find some semblance of closure, but I couldn't let it end there. I began saying prayers for both spirits, hoping that one day they could move on and find the peace they deserved. Even now, years later, I think about that night whenever I'm on the road. I've never returned to that stretch of highway, and I'm not sure I ever will. But I've learned to carry a sense of gratitude for the life I was allowed to keep and a quiet hope that the spirits of the road have finally found rest. My life has never been the same since that night. The accident changed me, not just physically but emotionally as well. Every time I hear the rain pattering on the roof or see fog rolling in, I'm reminded of how fragile life is. And I can't help but wonder if, somewhere out there, those two lost souls have finally found their way home. Last summer, I decided to take a road trip to reconnect with my two best friends from high school. Emily and Rachel had moved to Boulder, Colorado, to attend the University of Colorado, and since then, I've visited them every summer. We share a bond that feels more like sisters than friends, having gone through everything together during those formative years. Usually, I'd fly to visit them, but last year I chose to drive instead. There were several places I'd always wanted to see along the way, like national parks, quaint little museums, and fascinating historical landmarks. I started my journey early, determined to make the most of my time and explore all those sites. I knew it would take me a few days to reach Boulder, but the excitement of the adventure made the long drive worth it. The first 2 days went by smoothly. Everything felt ordinary and even enjoyable as I stopped at various locations. By the third night, however, things took a strange turn. Instead of arriving at my destination as planned, I was still on the road, hours behind schedule. It was already past 9 p.m., and the highway had become eerily quiet. There wasn't much traffic, which I usually found peaceful, but that night, it felt unsettling. Desolate roads have always unnerved me a little, but I tried to shake off the uneasiness. I still had a few hours of driving ahead, but fatigue was creeping in. I needed a restroom break and a strong cup of coffee to stay awake. Luckily, I spotted a sign for a rest stop at the next exit. It was a small, unassuming place, not one of those massive stops with truck parking and gas stations. This one had a tiny building and a single row of parking spaces. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough for my needs. When I pulled in, the place seemed deserted, with barely any lighting. Parking my car, I stepped out to stretch my legs, feeling the stiffness from hours of driving. As I walked towards the building, I noticed how quiet everything was. Inside, the setup was basic: a hallway with a janitor's closet, a women's restroom, and a men's restroom on opposite sides. There were a couple of vending machines and a rack of outdated magazines. While deciding on a drink from one of the machines, I heard the faint rumble of another car pulling into the lot. It parked directly next to mine, even though every other spot was free. I found this odd but shrugged it off, telling myself not to overthink it. I entered the restroom, did what I needed to do, and returned in about 5 minutes. The car was still parked beside mine, headlights on, and its engine idling. Curiosity mixed with unease as I wondered what the driver was doing. Trying to stay calm, I turned back to the vending machine and grabbed an energy drink. As I sipped it, my gaze kept drifting to the car. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me. When I finally decided to leave, I heard the engine turn off just as I reached the exit. A tall man stepped out, dressed in a worn brown leather jacket. His hands were buried in his pockets, and his piercing gaze locked onto me. I froze for a moment, my heart racing. There was something about the man that felt off. His gaze, sharp and unrelenting, carried an intensity that made me uneasy. I took a deep breath, trying to act natural, and moved toward my car. As we passed each other, I managed a small nod, hoping to avoid any confrontation. He returned the gesture, but just as I thought I was in the clear, I heard him call out, "Hey!" Instinctively, I turned around and my stomach dropped. The man was pointing a gun at me, a cold, black 9mm pistol aimed directly at my face. His lips curled into a sinister grin. "Why the rush?" he asked casually, as though we were old friends having a chat. My hands shot up, trembling. I could barely catch my breath as I stammered, "W, do you want?" "Your watch, your wallet, and your phone," he demanded. Without hesitation, I handed over everything he asked for, praying that it would end there. But it didn't. Instead of leaving, he jerked his head toward the forest behind the building. "Move," he barked. Fear surged through me as I realized he wasn't just here to rob me. He had something far worse in mind. My voice cracked as I pleaded, "Please, just take my car. You can have everything, just let me go." "Walk?" he repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. With my heart pounding in my chest, I did as he said, stepping into the shadowy forest. The deeper we went, the more convinced I became that I wouldn't make it out alive. I could barely think, consumed by panic and despair. After walking about 20 meters, he ordered me to stop and turn around. I obeyed, coming face to face with him. He was no more than 2 meters away, his gun pointed straight at me. My knees felt weak, and tears streamed down my face as I braced for the inevitable. "Kneel," he commanded. I dropped to my knees, my entire body trembling. This was it, I thought. These were my last moments. I closed my eyes tightly, waiting for the shot. Then, suddenly, the night shattered with the deafening sound of 3 gunshots. Bang, bang, bang. I screamed, instinctively covering my ears as I collapsed forward, convinced I'd been hit. But there was no pain, no blood, nothing. Slowly, I opened my eyes to see the man standing there, laughing hysterically. "Go home, kid," he said between chuckles. "And don't forget to wash your pants." With that, he turned and walked back toward his car, still laughing as though it were all a joke. I lay there for a moment, too stunned to move. Relief, humiliation, and terror crashed over me in waves. When I finally gathered the courage to check myself, I realized I was unharmed. I stumbled back to the restroom, splashing cold water on my face as I stared at my reflection. My cheeks were swollen, red, and streaked with tears. I looked and felt utterly defeated. Once I composed myself enough to leave, I got in my car and drove to the nearest town. There, I borrowed a phone to call the police and gave them a detailed account of what had happened. That night, I rented a room and tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't stop replaying the events. The next day, still shaken but determined, I drove straight to Emily and Rachel's house. When I told them what had happened, they were horrified. I stayed with them for 2 weeks, as I always did, but that summer was different. The trauma lingered, and even now, I can still feel the fear and humiliation whenever I think back on that night. I never heard if the man was caught or if he's still out there, preying on others. All I know is I've never stopped at a roadside rest stop since, and I doubt I ever will again. My name is Claire Foster, and everything I'm about to tell you happened in August 2008. That summer was one of the hottest I'd ever experienced. It was the kind of heat that sticks to your skin, even in the shade. At the time, I was behind the wheel of my trusty old freight truck, hauling a load of aluminum panels destined for a construction site in northern Arkansas. I'd been driving trucks for over 20 years, and by then, I believed there wasn't much that could shake me. But what happened that night? Well, it's something I'll never forget. The day started as usual. I was cruising along Highway 67, a stretch of road cutting through the Ozark National Forest. By daylight, the forest is breathtaking with its lush greenery and sunlit canopy. But as evening falls, the shadows stretch and the trees seem to close in, creating an eerie, desolate atmosphere. I had planned to make good time and stop at a small truck stop near Jonesboro to grab some food, use the restroom, and maybe catch a few hours of sleep. But just a few miles short of the stop, I spotted a rundown van parked on the side of the road with its hood propped open. As I approached, I saw a man waving his arms frantically. We truck drivers have an unspoken rule: help out a fellow traveler when you can. So I slowed down, pulled over a little ahead of the van, and climbed out to see if I could lend a hand. The man looked to be in his late 40s, wearing a grease-stained plaid shirt and a tattered baseball cap. His hands and face were smudged with oil, evidence of hours spent wrestling with his van. As I approached, he exhaled a sigh of relief and greeted me with a firm handshake. "Thank God you stopped," he said, his voice tired but grateful. "Name's Nate. Been stuck here for hours. My alternator's shot." He explained that he'd been driving from Mississippi to Springfield when his old van finally gave up. He asked if I could give him a lift to the nearest town, about 25 miles away, so he could find a mechanic and a place to stay for the night. I looked him over, trying to gauge if he was trustworthy. Nate seemed harmless, Just another unlucky traveler stranded in the middle of nowhere. Besides, I couldn't just leave him there. So I agreed. He grabbed a small duffel bag from his van and hopped into the passenger seat of my truck. As we started moving, Nate proved to be quite the talker. He told me about his life back in Mississippi, his struggles with the aging van, and how he was on his way to pick up some equipment for a job. About 15 minutes into our drive, I noticed something strange in my side mirror. Two vehicles, an old sedan and a beat-up pickup, had pulled onto the highway behind us. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming they were just other drivers out late. But as we continued down the empty road, the cars remained uncomfortably close, following us mile after mile. I glanced at Nate. "Do you know them?" I asked, motioning toward the rearview mirror. Nate turned to look and shook his head. "Never seen them before," he replied, his voice slightly shaky. I tried to laugh it off, joking, "You're not running from someone, are you?" He chuckled nervously. "Not at all," but his tone betrayed his unease. The longer the cars trailed us, the more unsettled I felt. Something about the way they stuck close didn't sit right. After another few miles, the road narrowed, flanked on both sides by dense forest. That's when the cars suddenly sped up, overtaking us and swerving to a stop directly in front of my truck, blocking the road. "What the hell?" I muttered, slamming on the brakes to avoid a collision. 3 men stepped out of the vehicles. Each one held a gun, their faces hidden by caps pulled low. My heart began to race as one of them motioned for us to get out of the truck. I glanced at Nate. His face had gone pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Whispering as calmly as I could, I told him to stay quiet and follow my lead. Raising my hands, I stepped out of the truck. "We don't want any trouble," I said. "Take whatever you want." The leader, a tall man with a rough voice, barked, "Empty your pockets." Phones, wallets, keys, everything. We did as we were told, handing over everything we had. Then the man tossed my truck keys back to me, his face expressionless. "Get in and drive," he ordered. Confused, I hesitated. "Drive where?" "Just do it," he snapped, waving his gun. With no other choice, I climbed back into the driver's seat. Nate was forced into one of their cars, sandwiched between 2 of the armed men, while the third stayed behind us, ensuring I wouldn't make any sudden moves. We drove for what felt like an eternity but was likely only 20 minutes. They led us down a narrow dirt road, deeper and deeper into the woods. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but nothing seemed feasible. I couldn't abandon Nate, and even if I tried, they'd catch me in seconds. The path ended in a small clearing surrounded by towering trees. The men ordered us out of the vehicles. As I stepped out of the truck, the weight of dread settled in my chest. If all they wanted was to rob us, why take us so far into the forest? The clearing was eerily quiet, the only sound the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The 3 armed men ushered Nate and me out of the vehicles, their guns trained on us. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The leader, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a permanent scowl, motioned for us to move. "Get walking," he barked, pointing his gun toward a narrow trail leading deeper into the woods. Nate stumbled forward, his hands trembling. What do you want from us?" he stammered. The leader didn't answer, just waved his gun in the direction he wanted us to go. The second man, a burly guy with a scruffy beard, chuckled darkly. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his voice dripping with malice. The third man, shorter but with a sinister grin that made my skin crawl, walked beside us, occasionally poking Nate in the back with his gun. As we trudged along the trail, the forest grew denser. The tall trees seemed to close in around us, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. The air grew colder, and the faint hum of crickets was the only reminder that we weren't entirely alone in the world. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged into a small clearing where a dilapidated cabin stood. Its roof sagged in the middle, and its walls were covered in moss and grime. The windows were broken, and the door hung askew on its hinges. My stomach twisted. Nothing good could come from this place. The leader motioned for us to go inside. "Move," he ordered, his voice sharp. Reluctantly, we stepped into the cabin. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and decay. A broken table and a couple of battered chairs were the only furniture in sight. Trash littered the floor, and cobwebs hung in every corner. "Sit down," the leader commanded, pointing to a sagging couch against the wall. Nate and I sat, the springs creaking under our weight. The shorter man grinned at us, pulling a coil of rope from his pocket. "Don't worry," he said mockingly. "This won't take long." He tied our hands and feet tightly, the rough rope digging into my skin. My mind raced. Why had they brought us here? If they just wanted to rob us, they could have done it on the road. Were they planning something worse? Once we were securely bound, the three men stepped back, their laughter echoing in the small cabin. "Don't go anywhere," the scruffy one joked, earning a round of chuckles from the others. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they left, slamming the door behind them. The sound of their car engines faded into the distance, leaving us alone in the oppressive silence of the woods. "Claire," Nate whispered, his voice trembling. "Do you think they're coming back?" "I don't know," I replied, struggling against the ropes. "But we're not going to wait around to find out." The knots were tight, and the coarse rope scraped against my wrists, but I refused to give up. After several agonizing minutes, I felt the bonds loosen slightly. "I'm almost free," I told Nate, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just hang in there." Nate nodded, though his pale face betrayed his fear. "You think they're going to kill us?" he asked quietly. "Not if we get out of here," I replied firmly, though my own fear gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Finally, I managed to slip my hands free. Wasting no time, I untied my feet and then worked on freeing Nate. "Thanks, Claire," he said, his voice cracking. "Save it for later," I said, helping him to his feet. "We need to get out of here before they come back." We stumbled out of the cabin and into the dark woods. The faint light of the moon filtered through the branches above, casting ghostly shadows on the ground. "Which way?" Nate asked, looking around nervously. I thought back to our drive-in. The dirt road had twisted and turned so many times that I wasn't sure which direction would lead us back to the highway. "This way," I said, pointing in the direction opposite the cabin. It was a guess, but it was better than standing still. We moved as quickly as we could, the forest around us alive with strange sounds. Branches snapped underfoot, and distant howls sent chills down my spine. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the faint outline of the road ahead. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. "What if they're out here looking for us?" Nate whispered. I didn't have an answer. The thought of running into those men again made my blood run cold. "Stay close to the edge of the trees," I said. "We'll keep moving and hope for the best." We walked along the road for what seemed like an eternity, the darkness stretching endlessly before us. My ears were attuned to every sound, straining to pick up any sign of an approaching vehicle. Finally, the faint rumble of an engine reached us. "Someone's coming," I whispered, pulling Nate into the shadows of the trees. The headlights of an old sedan appeared in the distance, growing brighter as the car approached. As it got closer, I realized it wasn't one of the vehicles from earlier. The car slowed, and I could make out the driver, a gray-haired man with a weathered face. "Hey, hey," I shouted, stepping out onto the road and waving my arms. The car rolled to a stop, and the driver rolled down his window, eyeing us suspiciously. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone wary. "Please, we need your help," I said quickly. "We were kidnapped and stranded out here. Can you call the police?" The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Get in. I'll take you to the nearest town." Nate and I climbed into the back seat, exhausted but relieved. The man, who introduced himself as Jeff, drove us to a small town about 20 miles away. He dropped us off at the sheriff's office, where we told our story to a grizzled officer named Deputy Ross. He listened intently, his expression grim. "You're lucky to be alive," Ross said after we finished. We'll send a patrol out there to look for these men." The deputies took us back to the clearing where the cabin was located, but by the time we arrived, the men were long gone. My truck, however, was found a few miles away, abandoned but otherwise undamaged. As I climbed back into the driver's seat, I couldn't shake the lingering fear. Nate and I parted ways at the next truck stop, exchanging phone numbers but knowing we'd likely never see each other again. The drive away from that nightmare was eerily quiet. The truck rumbled beneath me, the road stretching endlessly ahead, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Every shadow along the highway felt like it was hiding something. Every headlight in my mirror made my heart race. Nate had gone his own way after we parted at the truck stop, and while I was relieved to be alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ordeal wasn't over. By the time I reached the company yard to deliver my load, dawn was breaking. The light of day should have brought comfort, but instead, it exposed just how rattled I was. My boss, a gruff but fair man named Joe, noticed immediately. "Claire, you all right?" he asked, concern etched into his weathered face. I hesitated. "How do you sum up a night like that?" "Rough trip," I muttered, avoiding his gaze. Joe didn't press, but his eyes lingered on me as I climbed out of the cab. After filing my report and heading home, the silence of my small apartment was almost unbearable. I kept expecting a knock at the door or a shadow to move in the corner of my eye. I barely slept that night, haunted by dreams of those men and the forest cabin. Over the next few days, the sheriff's office kept in touch. Deputy Ross called to update me on their search. "We've combed through the area," he said, his voice grim over the phone. "We found the cabin, but it was empty. No sign of those men. We're keeping an eye out, though. You did the right thing reporting this. Do you think they'll come after us?" I asked, my voice shaking despite my attempt to sound calm. Ross hesitated before answering. "Unlikely. Criminals like this usually scatter after something goes wrong. But keep your doors locked and stay alert, just in case." That wasn't exactly comforting. Nate called me a few times, checking in and sharing his own nightmares about that night. He admitted he was considering leaving trucking altogether. "I don't know if I can get back behind the wheel, Claire," he said one evening. "Every time I think about being out there alone." His voice trailed off. I understood. Every trip after that felt different. I tried to go back to normal. The road had always been my refuge, a place where I felt in control, where the hum of the engine drowned out the noise of the world. But now, every trip carried an undercurrent of fear. Passing through southern Missouri a month later, I found myself gripping the wheel tighter as I neared the Mark Twain National Forest. The memory of that stretch of Highway 60 was vivid. The heat of the summer air, the sight of Nate waving me down, the cars in my rearview mirror. I pulled over at a rest stop outside the forest, my hands trembling. It was broad daylight, but the shadows of the trees seemed to creep closer. "You're okay," I muttered to myself. "It's just a road. Just another trip." But it wasn't just another trip. Later that evening, as I approached another desolate stretch of highway, I noticed headlights in my mirror. My heart sank. The vehicle behind me followed for several miles, staying just far enough back to make it impossible to see who was driving. I kept glancing at the mirror, my pulse quickening with every turn they made to stay behind me. Was it them? Had they found me? Finally, at a crossroads, the vehicle turned off, its headlights disappearing into the night. I let out a shaky breath, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly adjusted. I took extra precautions on every trip, double-checking my routes and making sure I stayed in well-lit areas whenever possible. I even started carrying a small personal alarm and a new phone with GPS tracking enabled. The company eventually relaxed its rules on drivers carrying firearms, but by then, I wasn't sure if having one would make me feel safer or just remind me of how vulnerable I'd felt that night. One day, I received a call from Deputy Ross. "We got a tip on those men," he said. "Someone matching their descriptions was spotted in another county, but they vanished before we could catch them. Seems they're still out there, but they've gone underground." The news sent a chill down my spine. Do you think they'll strike again? Hard to say, Ross replied. But folks like that don't stay quiet forever. It's been years since that night, but it's never really left me. I still drive, still haul loads across the country, but I'm not the same person I was before. Every dark stretch of highway feels like a test, every strange car in my rearview mirror a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong. But I keep going. The road is my livelihood, my identity, and even after everything, I can't imagine doing anything else. The forest, the cabin, and those men are now part of the stories I carry with me, stories I'll never forget but have learned to live with. The road is unpredictable and the dangers are real, but so is my resilience. No matter what happens, I'll keep moving forward. Because that's what I do. That's who I am. A truck driver always on the move, always watching, and always ready for whatever comes next. My name is Elena, and the story I'm about to share is the most terrifying thing I've ever experienced. It happened one late evening while I was driving home from work, a moment that has haunted me ever since. Back then, I worked night shifts in a quiet corner of New Mexico, in a small, remote hotel that used to be an old ranch. It was a peaceful job, easily the most relaxed I'd ever had. But the one thing I truly despised was the long commute home, nearly 2 hours through winding desert roads. At first, the sheer length of the drive wore me down. But over time, I adjusted. It became just another part of my routine. One night, after an especially tiring shift, I felt my stomach gnawing with hunger. I couldn't wait until I got home to eat. As luck would have it, I spotted a small food truck parked near the entrance of a dusty RV park. The truck had been there for a few weeks, its neon lights flickering faintly in the night, but I'd never stopped before. I was always rushing home. That night was different. Hunger overruled everything. I pulled over, parked my car nearby, and walked up to the truck. The moment I approached, the smell hit me. It was incredible: spices, grilled meat, and fresh tortillas. The man working the stand, a friendly middle-aged guy with a scruffy beard, greeted me warmly. His tacos were unlike anything I'd tasted before. It could have been the hunger, but they felt like a slice of heaven. I ate in my car that night, savoring every bite. As I drove the rest of the way home, I couldn't stop thinking about those tacos. The next evening, I found myself stopping at the same truck again. And then again the night after that. Before I knew it, grabbing a few tacos on my way home became a routine. I didn't just wolf them down in my car anymore. I'd linger by the truck, trying the different sauces the man offered and chatting with him as he worked. 4 months, this became my nightly ritual. I must have stopped there at least 50 times, maybe more. But strangely, despite all those visits, I never learned the man's name. It wasn't intentional, it just never came up. He didn't ask mine either, so I figured it didn't matter. Looking back, I regret that. One night, everything changed. That night started like any other. I parked my car in the usual spot near the food truck. As I stepped out, something felt off. The air seemed colder than usual, and there was an eerie stillness around the RV park. I walked up to the truck, expecting to see the man busy at his grill, but he wasn't there. The truck was empty, and there wasn't a single customer in sight. I glanced around, thinking he might have stepped away to restock something or handle a quick errand, but there was no sign of him. At first, I wasn't worried. Maybe he was just running late. I waited a few minutes, but as time passed, the unease started to creep in. The silence around me became oppressive. Usually, there'd be faint noises from the RV park, TVs playing, people chatting, but tonight, it was completely quiet. Then I noticed the smell. It wasn't the usual mouth-watering aroma of grilled meat and spices. This was different, a sharp, acrid smell, like something burning. I peered at the grill from where I stood but couldn't see anything clearly. Smoke was starting to waft into the air, faint but unmistakable. "Hey!" I called out, my voice breaking the silence. "You're burning something." No answer. Frustrated, I stepped closer. The truck was larger than most food trucks, almost like a small mobile kitchen, so I couldn't see the grill's surface from where I stood. I tiptoed, trying to get a better look, but it was no use. The smell was getting stronger, and thin wisps of smoke were curling up into the air. Worried that the flames might spread, I decided to check inside the truck. Maybe he had a medical emergency and needed help, or maybe he'd left something on and forgotten to turn it off. Either way, I couldn't just stand there and do nothing. I walked around to the side of the truck, where a narrow door with retractable steps led inside. I hesitated for a moment. It felt wrong to invade someone's space like that, but the growing smell of burning convinced me otherwise. I pulled the handle and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the cash register. It was open, the drawer pulled out and overturned, with loose coins scattered across the countertop. My stomach sank. The scene screamed robbery. Yet, something didn't add up. Everything else was strangely untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no overturned furniture. It was like someone had taken the money and left without a fight. Still, the smell lingered, and it was stronger inside. I turned toward the grill, climbing a small set of steps to get closer. As I reached the top, I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart pounded like a drum. On the grill was the charred, blackened outline of a human hand. The fingers were curled slightly, as if frozen mid-motion, and the skin was scorched to an unnatural jet-black hue. The sight was so horrifying that I stumbled backward, nearly losing my balance on the metal steps. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a prank? An accident? But the smell, the heat radiating from the grill, it was too real. I forced myself to snap out of it. Trembling, I stepped forward and reached for the knob beneath the grill to turn off the flame. My hands shook as I twisted it, and the small hiss of gas fading out was the only sound in the deafening silence. I needed to get out of there. I scrambled down the steps, my heart still racing. As I exited the truck, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My fingers fumbled over the screen, and when the operator picked up, I stammered out the details. A robbery, the truck's location, and the disturbing thing I'd seen on the grill. The operator asked me to stay on the line, but I barely heard her. My mind was spinning, filled with questions and dread. Who had done this? Where was the man who ran the truck? Was he okay? I stayed near the truck, pacing back and forth as I waited for the police to arrive. Minutes turned into what felt like hours. No flashing lights appeared on the horizon. No one showed up, not the cops, not the man from the truck, not even a single soul from the RV park. After what felt like an eternity, I realized no one was coming. The silence around the RV park was suffocating, and the sight of the truck loomed in the corner of my vision like a dark shadow I couldn't ignore. I considered leaving, just driving home and pretending this had never happened, but a nagging thought kept me rooted to the spot. What if the man came back? What if he needed help? I decided to wait a little longer, but time dragged on, and no one appeared. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the fear, the questions, the uncertainty, it was too much. I got into my car and started the long drive home. The road stretched out before me, dark and empty, as my thoughts spiraled. What had happened to him? Who had left that horrifying mark on the grill? And why hadn't the police arrived after I'd reported something so serious? When I finally reached home, I collapsed onto my bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The image of the burned hand was seared into my mind. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how little I actually knew about the man who ran the truck. I'd stopped there dozens of times, chatted with him almost nightly, but I didn't even know his name. The next day, I tried searching for answers. I Googled everything I could think of: taco truck robbery, food truck New Mexico, man burned in grill incident. But nothing came up. No news articles, no police reports, no mention of anything even remotely similar to what I'd seen. I drove past the spot on my way to work that evening, hoping to find some sign of the man or the truck, but it was gone. The RV park looked just as lifeless as it had the night before, and there was no trace that the food truck had ever been there. Days turned into weeks, and I never saw the truck again. It was as if it had vanished into thin air, along with the man who ran it. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something more sinister happened that night. The details don't add up. The abandoned truck, the scattered cash, the burned hand on the grill. I still wonder if I missed something, some clue that could have explained it all. Maybe if I'd stayed longer, I would have seen the police arrive or caught a glimpse of the man returning. But deep down, I know it wouldn't have made a difference. Wherever he is, I just hope he's okay. This happened 6 years ago, sometime in June 2018. Back then, I was in my early 20s, just finishing my first year of college, and feeling a mix of excitement and pressure about the future. My name is Mia, and like many people, I've always enjoyed traveling. The idea of visiting new places, soaking in the sights, and experiencing life on the open road has always had a special appeal to me. So, on a whim, I decided to take a solo day trip to a few spots I'd always wanted to visit before returning to college in August. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a chance to cross a couple of nearby landmarks off my list. The plan was simple: get up early, hit the road, see as much as possible during the day, and drive back home late that night. This way, I could maximize my time while avoiding the cost of a hotel. At the time, saving money was a big priority for me, and I didn't mind long drives or staying up late, so the idea seemed perfect. The trip started off without a hitch. I had packed a small bag, filled my water bottle, and grabbed snacks for the road. The drive to the first location was smooth, and I spent the day exploring different sites, enjoying the solitude and the freedom of being on my own schedule. It was exhilarating to stand in the middle of beautiful landscapes, knowing I had the whole day ahead of me to roam wherever I pleased. By the time the sun was setting, I felt accomplished and content. I hadn't realized how much I had missed these little adventures. But as much fun as I had, I knew it was time to head back. I ended up leaving the last spot around 10 p.m., later than I originally planned. My GPS estimated it would take about 4.5 hours to get home. No problem, I thought. I had driven late at night before, and I was confident I could make it. For the first couple of hours, the drive went fine. I sang along to my playlist, sipped water, and occasionally rolled down the windows to let the cool night air wake me up. But as the clock ticked closer to midnight, I started to feel the telltale signs of exhaustion creeping in. My eyelids grew heavier, and the music wasn't as energizing as it had been earlier. I tried splashing water on my face and pinching my arms, but nothing seemed to help. I knew I had to stop before it became dangerous to drive. At the next rest stop, I told myself, I'll pull over and take a short nap. Just an hour. That's all I need. A few miles down the highway, I spotted the glowing lights of a rest stop and turned into the parking lot. The place was eerily empty. Not a single car was parked there, and for a moment, I wondered if the building was even open. But the lights inside reassured me. It made sense that the place would be deserted. It was late, and this wasn't a particularly busy highway. I parked near the entrance, locked my doors, and leaned my seat back to catch some sleep. I set an alarm for 1 hour and drifted off almost immediately. When the alarm blared, I groggily woke up and realized I needed to use the restroom. Typical me, my bladder always had the worst timing. Annoyed but knowing I couldn't wait until I got home, I stepped out of my car and walked toward the building. Inside, the place felt even more desolate. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the air smelled stale. I quickly found the women's restroom, went inside, and chose one of the stalls. I had barely been in there for 30 seconds when I heard something that made my stomach tighten, a voice in the hallway outside the restroom. At first, I thought I must have imagined it. My car was the only one in the parking lot, and I hadn't heard the door open. How could someone else be here? I froze, listening intently. Sure enough, faint murmuring echoed from the hallway. Then, the restroom door creaked open. My pulse quickened, but I reassured myself that it was probably just another traveler who had stopped to rest. Still, the timing felt strange. I finished quickly and was about to leave when I heard a light knock on my stall door. Startled, I said, "Occupied," expecting the person to apologize or leave. But there was no response. The knock didn't come again, but the silence felt heavier than before. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Then I saw it, an eye peering through the tiny gap in the stall door. My breath caught in my throat. The person on the other side didn't move, and for a moment, neither did I. But when our eyes met, the stranger let out a blood-curdling scream that sent chills down my spine. Before I could react, they started slamming their head against the door over and over, making the entire stall rattle. I panicked, bracing myself against the door to keep it from flying open. My mind raced. What was this person doing? Were they trying to hurt me? My body moved on instinct. I shoved the stall door open with all my strength, knocking the person backward. Without looking back, I bolted out of the restroom and toward the parking lot. As I reached my car, I heard the building's front door slam open behind me. I glanced back and saw the figure running after me. My heart was pounding as I fumbled to unlock my car. Somehow, I managed to get the door open, jump inside, and start the engine. But just as I began backing out, the person slammed into the side of my car, their hands clawing at the window. I hit the gas, speeding out of the parking lot, but not before catching one last glimpse of them in my rearview mirror. They were standing in the middle of the road, staring after me. I couldn't shake the way they looked, calm, almost unfazed, as if the entire encounter had been a normal part of their night. The drive home felt like an eternity. My hands were shaking, and my mind replayed the events over and over. Who was that person? What were they doing out there in the middle of nowhere? Were they dangerous or just unwell? The more I thought about it, the less it made sense. I didn't stop again for the rest of the drive. Sleep was no longer an issue. Adrenaline kept me wide awake. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in my car for a long time, trying to process what had happened. The whole experience felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. To this day, I still don't have answers. Was it a homeless person who had wandered far from civilization? Or was it something more sinister? I'll never know. What I do know is that I haven't stopped at a rest stop since that night, and I don't plan to anytime soon. Some fears stick with you for a lifetime, and for me, rest stops are forever tainted by that terrifying encounter. Looking back, I sometimes wonder if I should have reported the incident to the authorities. Maybe they could have checked the area and found the person. But at the time, all I wanted was to get as far away as possible and never think about it again. Even now, sharing this story gives me chills. It's a reminder that life is unpredictable and that the most ordinary situations can turn into the stuff of nightmares. I try not to let fear control me, but I've learned to trust my instincts and prioritize safety even when it feels inconvenient. Sometimes, it's the little choices, like deciding to stop or keep driving, that can make all the difference. When I was in 8th grade, my mom surprised everyone by buying her dream car. She worked hard for years, and this was her reward to herself. It was a sleek, pearl-white Mazda MX-5 Miata convertible. I couldn't drive back then, so I didn't know much about the specs, but I remember thinking it was the coolest car I had ever seen. It gleamed in the sunlight, its metallic accents catching the light like jewels. It wasn't just a car, it was a statement. That summer, my mom decided we'd go on a road trip to break in her new ride. She framed it as a bonding experience for us, something to remember when I got older. She even promised to teach me a few driving basics during the trip. The idea of spending a week with just my mom sounded both exciting and daunting. She wasn't the type to compromise when it came to schedules or rules. But the thought of adventure won out, and I agreed. We spent weeks planning the trip, marking out routes on old-fashioned paper maps and choosing landmarks we wanted to see. We decided to head east first, toward the Colorado Rockies, and then loop south to New Mexico before circling back through the Midwest. My mom was meticulous in packing the car, making sure we had essentials like snacks, water, and a few changes of clothes, even though the trunk barely had enough space for a backpack. When the day finally came, we set out early, the convertibles top down, music blasting through the car's tiny but powerful speakers. The wind tugged at my hair, and the sun warmed my skin as we cruised down the highway. My mom and I sang along to her favorite tunes, old rock ballads she said were timeless classics. And she told me stories from her own childhood, stories I had heard 100 times but didn't mind hearing again. There was something special about how those stories sounded when we were on the open road. The scenery was stunning. The further we got from home, the more vibrant the landscape became. Rolling hills turned into jagged mountains, and the air smelled fresher, cleaner. We stopped frequently, not because we needed to but because we wanted to soak in the views. My mom loved taking pictures, and she insisted on documenting every moment with her old digital camera. We stopped at roadside diners, where we devoured greasy burgers and shared milkshakes, laughing about the mess we made. One of my favorite things about the trip was how much my mom loosened up. Normally, she was all business, a strict, no-nonsense single mom, but on this trip, she seemed freer. She let me pick the music sometimes and even let me eat junk food without lecturing me about my choices. We talked about everything from my favorite books to her dreams of traveling abroad one day. It felt like we were equals, not just mother and daughter. By the fourth day, we found ourselves in a small mountain town that seemed to exist outside of time. The streets were cobblestone, the shops quaint, and the people impossibly friendly. We checked into a cozy lodge that looked like it had been plucked straight from a fairy tale. After unpacking, we wandered through the town, exploring antique shops and sampling local treats. That night, we had dinner at a tiny restaurant that served the best pasta I'd ever tasted. The place was warm and inviting, with candles on every table and soft music playing in the background. My mom looked around and sighed, saying, "This is the kind of place I've always dreamed of living in." Later, as we walked back to the lodge, the streets were quiet and dark, lit only by the occasional street lamp. I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It was just the two of us, away from the chaos of everyday life. Back at the lodge, I noticed a small group of people gathered around a truck in the parking lot. They were laughing loudly, their voices echoing in the still night air. My mom glanced at them but didn't say anything. She wasn't the type to get involved in other people's business, so we just headed inside. Our room was cozy, with 2 twin beds, a small TV, and a window that overlooked the parking lot. As we settled in for the night, my mom pulled out a bag of peanut M&Ms, her favorite road trip snack, and we started watching reruns of an old sitcom. It was nice, just the two of us relaxing after a long day. Around 10 p.m., the noise outside grew louder. I peeked out the window and saw the same group from earlier, now joined by a few more people. They were drinking and laughing, their voices carrying through the night. My mom noticed me watching and said, "It's just a bunch of rowdy kids. Don't let them bother you." But as the night went on, the mood outside shifted. The laughter turned to shouting, and I could sense tension in the air. My mom, who had already fallen asleep, woke up and frowned. She got out of bed, pulled on her robe, and peeked through the blinds. Her face was calm, but I could tell she was on edge. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just some people who don't know how to behave," she replied, her tone sharp. She hesitated for a moment before turning to me and saying, "Stay here. Lock the door and don't let anyone in. I'm going to see what's going on." Before I could protest, she grabbed her phone and stepped outside. My heart raced as I watched her walk toward the group, her figure barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but her body language was firm and confident. The group quieted down as she spoke, and after a few minutes, they began to disperse. When she returned, she looked tired but relieved. "They're gone," she said simply. "Try to get some sleep." I nodded, though I knew it would be a long time before I could calm down enough to rest. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I remember is being jolted awake by loud banging on the door. Someone was shouting, their voice desperate and frantic. "Help me! Please let me in!" I sat up, my heart pounding. My mom was already awake, her expression grim. She motioned for me to stay quiet and reached for the pepper spray she always carried in her purse. The banging continued, and the voice grew more desperate. "They're going to kill me. Please." My mom crept to the window and peeked outside. Her face hardened, and she whispered, "Call 911." I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed. Before I could hit the call button, the pounding stopped, replaced by muffled voices and the sound of footsteps approaching. I peeked through the window and saw a man standing by the door, his clothes torn and his face bloodied. A group of people was closing in on him, their intentions clear. Without hesitation, my mom flung open the door and stepped outside, holding the pepper spray in one hand and her phone in the other. "Back off," she shouted, her voice steady and commanding. The group froze, clearly startled by her sudden appearance. She pointed to the man and said, "Get inside." He hesitated for a moment before stumbling into the room. My mom stood her ground, glaring at the group until they finally retreated into the shadows. When she came back inside, she locked the door and turned to the man. "What happened?" she asked. Through gasps and sobs, he explained that he had been attacked by the group while trying to get to his truck. He had been staying in the lodge while working on a construction project nearby, and the group had targeted him for reasons he didn't understand. Before we could say anything else, the sound of sirens filled the air. Police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights flashing. Officers quickly took control of the situation, and the group scattered. The man thanked my mom repeatedly, tears streaming down his face. "You saved my life," he said, his voice choked with emotion. My mom just nodded, her expression unreadable. Once the police had taken statements and the situation was under control, we finally went back to bed. Neither of us slept much that night, but as the sun rose the next morning, I felt a deep sense of pride in my mom. She had faced danger head-on and protected not just me, but a stranger in need. As we drove away from the lodge, the wind whipping through my hair once again, I realized that this trip wasn't just about bonding or breaking in a new car. It was about learning who my mom really was: brave, strong, and unshakable. And that was a lesson I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. I'm an amateur photographer with an obsession for capturing the beauty of nature. My passion lies in still shots of sweeping landscapes and thrilling action shots like eagles soaring over rivers or the shimmering glow of a full moon over a lake. Although I'm far from professional, I've always loved experimenting with different kinds of photography. For a long time, my fixation was on capturing the perfect shot of lightning. A single electric bolt splitting the sky or a web of light stretching across the heavens. I had seen awe-inspiring collections of such photos online, and I was determined to get one myself. I wasn't alone in this adventure. My best friend, Diana, shared my love for exploration, even if she wasn't as invested in photography. Diana had a creative streak of her own, always coming up with quirky ideas for our shoots, often putting herself in the frame as the model. So, when I pitched the idea of a road trip to chase storms in the Southwest, Diana was all in. We did our homework. After weeks of research, we discovered that the Southwest experiences a monsoon season where torrential rains stretch across hundreds of miles, producing spectacular thunderstorms. This was the perfect opportunity for lightning photography. One location kept coming up during our search: Monument Point, a remote area in the desert where the borders of 4 states, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado, intersect. Not only was it a unique spot geographically, but it was also known for its incredible storms during monsoon season. Diana and I packed up my old hatchback with all the essentials. Along with my camera gear and our clothes, we threw in random props and costumes for Diana's modeling ideas. We even packed a tent and camping supplies, just in case. Looking back, we were ambitious, 2 young women setting off on a long road trip to an isolated desert. But at the time, all we cared about was the thrill of the journey. The first leg of the trip was smooth. We cruised through multiple states, stopping at roadside diners and snapping photos of quirky landmarks. In Colorado, We even stumbled upon a local music festival where I got some great candid shots of the performers. That night, we stayed in a small town called Durango, waking up early the next day to complete the final stretch of our drive. The road to Monument Point was breathtaking. We drove through rolling hills and rugged landscapes, passing through tiny towns that felt like something out of a storybook. As we neared our destination, the weather began to change. Dark clouds loomed in the distance, towering over the horizon like mountains made of smoke. "This is it," Diana exclaimed, leaning forward to get a better view through the windshield. By the time we reached Monument Point, the atmosphere was electric. Literally. The humidity was so thick it felt like you could cut it with a knife. The static in the air made the hairs on our arms and necks stand up. I couldn't believe how surreal it all felt. The Monument Point Visitor Center was modest. A few small buildings and a large circular slab of concrete marking the exact spot where the four states meet. A handful of tourists milled about, taking photos and exploring the area. Diana and I joined the short line to take our own pictures standing in 4 states at once. As we posed, the first drops of rain began to fall, huge, heavy droplets that quickly turned into a downpour. The storm was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Thick, black clouds churned in the sky, blotting out the sun and making the mid-afternoon feel like nightfall. The rain pelted down in sheets, soaking the ground in moments. Diana and I scrambled back to the car, laughing and fumbling with our gear, trying to keep it dry. "This is insane," Diana shouted, her voice barely audible over the roar of thunder. We huddled in the car, dripping wet but exhilarated. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the desert in eerie flashes. This was exactly what I'd come for. I adjusted my camera, aiming through the windshield to capture the dazzling display. Diana rummaged through the back seat, pulling out snacks and a thermos of coffee. "Might as well settle in," she said, handing me a cup. The storm seemed to have scared off most of the other visitors. One by one, cars in the parking lot started pulling out, their taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked distance. Soon, it was just us and a single car parked across the lot, a muddy SUV with tinted windows. I noticed it because it hadn't moved despite the worsening weather. "Think there's storm chasers too?" I mused aloud, pointing it out to Diana. She shrugged, peering through her window. "Maybe, or just crazy like us." The SUV's driver door suddenly swung open, and a figure leapt into the rain. It was a man, maybe mid-20s, wearing a plain shirt and jeans. He didn't run to seek shelter or even fumble for an umbrella. Instead, he stood there for a moment, letting the rain drench him before throwing his arms wide and spinning like a child in a sprinkler. "What the hell?" Diana muttered, leaning closer to the glass. The man started to peel off his shirt, flinging it into the wind. Then he was skipping around, splashing in puddles, and spinning in circles like he didn't have a care in the world. At first, Diana and I giggled. His carefree attitude was contagious. "Maybe he's just living his best life," I joked. But then it got weird. Piece by piece, the man began stripping off more clothing. First his shoes, then his socks, then his jeans. "Is he seriously?" Diana began, but her voice trailed off as the man flung his jeans into the mud and started running around in just his boxers. The laughter died in our throats. We sat there in stunned silence as he continued his bizarre dance, rolling in the mud and splashing through puddles like a child at play. Then, without warning, he stopped and turned toward us. "Is he looking at us?" Diana whispered, her voice tight. I nodded, my hands gripping the steering wheel. The man started walking in our direction. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost predatory. "Lock the doors," Diana hissed, scooting closer to me. "They're already locked," I replied, my voice shaking. The man reached our car and circled it like a predator sizing up its prey. He leaned close to Diana's window, cupping his hands against the glass and peering inside. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Diana shrank back, pressing herself against me. "What does he want?" she whispered. The man didn't knock or speak. Instead, he moved to the back door and tried the handle. It didn't budge. He tried the front passenger door next, rattling the handle with more force. When that didn't work, he went to the trunk, tugging on it as if he expected it to pop open. "Start the car," Diana urged. I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling as I turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, startling the man. He stepped back, his head snapping up to glare at us. Then, to our horror, he started laughing, loud, maniacal laughter that cut through the storm like a blade. "Go!" Diana shouted. I shifted into reverse, the tires skidding on the wet ground as I backed out of the parking spot. The man didn't give up. He ran alongside the car, slapping his hands against the windows and shouting incoherently. The rain made it hard to see, but I could feel his presence, close and relentless. "Is he still there?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yes," Diana cried. "He's following us." I turned the car toward the highway, navigating the muddy lot as quickly as I dared. The man kept pace, his bare feet splashing through puddles. Finally, as we reached the edge of the parking lot, he stopped. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, arms spread wide, laughing into the rain. We didn't stop until we were miles away, pulling off at a small rest area to catch our breath. The storm had lessened, though lightning still crackled in the distance. Diana and I sat in silence for a while, staring out at the darkened horizon. "Who was that guy?" Diana finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know," I replied, shaking my head, "but I'm not sure I want to find out." We checked the car for damage and reorganized our gear before deciding to call it a night. The photos could wait. All we wanted now was to get away from that eerie parking lot and its strange, naked inhabitant. After what felt like an eternity of tense silence, Diana spoke again. "Do you think he followed us?" I glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind us was empty except for the faint shimmer of puddles reflecting the stormy sky. "No," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "We've been driving for miles. If he had a car, we'd have seen it by now." That seemed to calm her down a bit, but the unease lingered. We sat in the rest area for a while, eating the snacks we'd packed and sipping lukewarm coffee. The storm continued to rage around us, but it felt different now, less thrilling, more ominous. "I can't stop thinking about him," Diana admitted, staring out the window at the rain. "What was he even doing out there? He didn't look homeless or anything. He looked normal. Normal except for the part where he got naked and tried to break into our car," I said, attempting to lighten the mood. Diana didn't laugh. "Let's just get back on the road," she said. I nodded, starting the car. The storm was still too intense to make much progress toward the next town, but we decided to head back to the highway and find a safer spot to spend the night. As I carefully navigated the rain-soaked road, my mind kept drifting back to the man at Monument Point. Something about his behavior didn't sit right with me, not just the naked dancing, but the way he'd stared at us, as though he knew us somehow. We drove in near silence for the next hour, the storm making it impossible to talk over the constant drum of rain on the roof. Every now and then, lightning would illuminate the road ahead, casting eerie shadows on the surrounding desert. Diana dozed off eventually, her head resting against the window. I envied her ability to sleep through the storm, but I was too wired to relax. As the minutes stretched on, I started to notice something strange. A pair of headlights appeared in the distance, far behind us. At first, I thought it was just another car, but the longer I drove, the closer the lights seemed to get. I nudged Diana awake. "Hey, there's a car behind us." "So?" she mumbled, groggy. "It's been there for a while," I said. "And it's catching up." Diana sat up, rubbing her eyes. She glanced in the side mirror, her expression shifting from sleepy to alert. "Do you think it's him?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't like it." The headlights grew brighter, the car closing the gap between us. It wasn't speeding, but it wasn't keeping a normal distance either. It felt deliberate, like whoever was driving wanted us to know they were there. "Let's pull over," Diana suggested. "See if they pass us." Reluctantly, I agreed. I eased off the gas and pulled onto the shoulder, the tires sinking slightly into the mud. The other car slowed down too, stopping a few hundred feet behind us. "That's not normal," Diana said, her voice tight with fear. "No, it's not," I agreed. I shifted back into drive and pulled back onto the road. The other car followed, maintaining the same unnervingly close distance. "Okay, this is officially creepy," Diana said, gripping the edge of her seat. "What do we do?" I thought for a moment, then made a sudden left turn onto a narrow dirt road. The car behind us hesitated for a moment before following. My stomach twisted in knots. "They're definitely following us," Diana said, her voice rising. "I know," I said, trying to keep my own panic in check. The dirt road led us deeper into the desert, the storm making it almost impossible to see. The headlights behind us stayed steady, like a predator stalking its prey. Diana fumbled with her phone, trying to get a signal, but it was no use. We were too far from any towns or cell towers. Finally, the road ended at a small clearing surrounded by jagged rocks. There was nowhere else to go. I stopped the car and killed the engine, plunging us into darkness. The other car pulled in behind us, its headlights blinding us through the rearview mirror. "What do we do?" Diana whispered, her voice trembling. "Stay here," I said. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." "What about you?" "I'm just going to talk to them," I lied. "Stay here." I stepped out of the car, my heart pounding so loudly I could hear it over the storm. The rain soaked me instantly, but I barely noticed. I approached the other car cautiously, shielding my eyes from the glare of the headlights. "Hey!" I shouted. "What do you want?" There was no response. The driver's door opened slowly, and a figure stepped out. My breath caught in my throat. It was him. The man from Monument Point. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaky. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled, a slow, unsettling grin that made my skin crawl. He took a step toward me, and I stumbled back. "Stay away," I shouted, my voice cracking. The man stopped, tilting his head like he was studying me. Then, without warning, he turned and walked back to his car. He climbed inside, and a moment later, the headlights disappeared as he drove off into the storm. I stood there for a long time, drenched and shaking, before Diana ran out to pull me back to the car. "What happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with fear. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "But he's gone." We didn't wait to see if he'd come back. We drove through the night, only stopping when we reached a well-lit gas station hours later. We never saw the man again, but the memory of that stormy night still haunts me. If you ever visit the Southwest during monsoon season, take my advice. Enjoy the storms, but watch out for the strangers they bring. The summer before my senior year, my best friend and I decided to go on the kind of road trip that would be remembered forever. We had just graduated from high school after 4 years of juggling everything. Not just schoolwork, but sports, extracurricular activities, and student council. We were busy, ambitious, and exhausted. That last year, though, we developed this feeling, a kind of FOMO. We watched everyone else living it up, having the best time of their lives. And by the time it was finally our turn, we were more than ready to let loose. The only thing we hadn't expected was our friend Sarah tagging along. Sarah and I had been friends since middle school. She had this unique vibe to her. She was the kind of person who could disappear for months at a time. She'd gone off on her own, lived in different places, done all sorts of things. The thing was, she always came back, and somehow we kept this on-again, off-again friendship going. When Sarah found out about our trip, she made it clear she wanted to join. We hadn't really planned on anyone else coming with us, but she was persuasive. Sarah had been through a lot. A big life change, a new perspective, and that summer, she seemed like a different person. Anyway, despite some mixed feelings about her joining, we hit the road that summer with Sarah in tow. Our goal? To drive west across the country, hit all the iconic spots, and end up somewhere along the coast. It wasn't just a trip, It was a declaration of freedom. The plan was simple: take 14 days, including 6 full days of driving. We had mapped out a route through the Midwest, aiming for the coast. The Grand Canyon, the rocky desert formations of Utah, the ruins of ancient pueblos in Colorado, we wanted to see it all. Our final destination was the Monterey area, somewhere by the ocean, where we'd spend a week just living as beach bums. No agenda, no deadlines, just pure, unfiltered freedom. From the moment we left, everything seemed to fall into place. The weather was perfect, gas was affordable, and there were no major obstacles. The open road was waiting for us. We cranked up the music, shared laughs, and left behind the familiar streets of our hometown. As we crossed into the next state, everything started to look new, fresh, and full of promise. We were so excited that we barely stopped to rest the first night. We just drove. We took turns behind the wheel, pushing ourselves further and further. By the time the sun came up, we were in a daze. We ended up getting a hotel and crashed as soon as we could. We had bitten off more than we could chew that first day, but the rest of the trip was smooth sailing after that. We kept it simple, kept it safe, and learned to pace ourselves. 5 days into the trip, we were cruising through the heart of California. We passed through towns that felt like they hadn't changed in decades, places where poverty and decay were everywhere. It was surreal. Sarah, of course, had seen these types of places before, growing up in a town not too different. But for me, it was shocking to witness how bad things could get. It wasn't just the rundown homes and abandoned buildings. It was the people. Some of them seemed like they'd been stuck in this cycle of poverty their whole lives. And what was even stranger was how normal it all seems to the people living there. They went about their daily routines, seemingly unaffected by the desolate surroundings. As we left these towns behind, we started to see more drifters on the roads, people hitchhiking, walking along the highways. The thought of picking up a hitchhiker had always seemed like something out of a movie, but it also felt like a rite of passage. We were young, eager, and full of empathy for those living on the edge. So I brought it up. "Hey," I said, looking over at Sarah, "what do you think about picking up a hitchhiker? I mean, it could be cool, right? Help someone out." Sarah, sitting in the back, laughed. "You're crazy. Have you never seen a horror movie?" "What?" I asked, confused. "You know, that one with the hitchhiker? He kills everyone in the car with a knife." Sarah said, laughing. "Oh, right," I replied. "That's not gonna happen. We're fine." It wasn't like I hadn't considered the dangers. I'd heard all the stories, but we were young, idealistic, and wanted to have those moments that felt bigger than us. Plus, I'd picked up hitchhikers before, and nothing ever happened. There was a part of me that figured it'd be an adventure. All right, Sarah said, rolling her eyes. "Just don't come crying to me if we end up dead in a ditch somewhere." But that's how we ended up picking up Croy. We saw him a couple of miles outside a small town, leaning against the side of the road, casually smoking a cigarette. He looked to be about our age, maybe a bit older. His bleached hair stuck out in every direction, and he wore a skin-tight black t-shirt, baggy jeans, and painted nails. He had a duffel bag sitting by his feet. "That's our guy," I said, nodding toward him. Sarah gave me a skeptical look but didn't protest. We pulled off the road and, to my surprise, Croy didn't hesitate. He picked up his bag and walked straight over to the car without even pausing to check us out. "Thanks for the ride," he said, climbing in. "I'm Croy, by the way." We introduced ourselves, and Croy immediately started talking. He seemed genuinely interested in us and the trip we were on. He'd lived in California his whole life and told us all about his adventures, the bands he'd followed, the places he'd stayed, the people he'd met. He'd been traveling for 5 years, after dropping out of school and getting involved in drugs. He talked about getting clean and returning home a few times, but now he was back on the road again. We listened to his story, but the more we learned about him, the stranger things got. At first, he seemed like just another traveler, but something about his energy was off. We tried to ignore it, but it wasn't easy. He asked if he could smoke in the car, and after a brief exchange, we agreed. "It's not like this car is brand new anyway," Sarah muttered, clearly uncomfortable but trying to be polite. As the afternoon wore on, Croy kept chain smoking, and we drifted deeper into conversation. But it wasn't long before the trip took a turn. The night that followed our encounter with Croy was tense. We parked the car behind the hotel to make sure it wasn't visible from the street, as though hiding it would somehow make the night feel less uncomfortable. After dinner at a small pizza joint and some quick games at an old arcade, we went back to the room. As tired as we were from the drive, no one really slept well. I couldn't stop thinking about Croy. Something about his unpredictable nature, the way he'd flip a switch from being calm to suddenly wild, kept me on edge. I woke up early, probably too early for a road trip. My body was used to long hours of driving, but it was the lingering feeling of unease that was harder to shake off. Jackson was still snoring in the bed next to me, and I figured I'd take a quick walk to clear my head. I put on my shoes and headed out to the parking lot. As I got closer to the car, my heart sank. There were papers scattered all around the windshield. My first instinct was that it was some kind of prank, but then I saw the cigarette butts all over the ground. It didn't take much for me to realize what had happened. Croy had been here and he had gone through the car. My stomach twisted. I approached slowly, stepping over the crumpled pages that had fallen from the window. It looked like pages from the book that had been in his duffel bag, the one with the weird, unsettling philosophy. I opened the car door and checked the back seat. The first thing I noticed was the absence of the duffel bag. That was strange. Had he taken it back? Had he left anything else? I was nervous now, looking around for signs that Croy was lurking somewhere close. Maybe he was just watching from the shadows, waiting for us to make our move. Inside the car, there was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that could explain the feeling of someone watching me. But those damn pages. Why was Croy hanging around, and what was he hoping to accomplish? The thought of him rifling through our stuff without us knowing made my skin crawl. I took a deep breath and slammed the door shut, shaking off the unease. I couldn't linger too long. We had to get moving if we wanted to stay on track with the rest of our trip. I rushed back inside and grabbed my stuff. Jackson was just waking up, stretching his arms and groaning. He didn't look too concerned, which made me feel like I might be overreacting. But I couldn't shake the feeling. Croy had left his mark on us, and I wasn't sure if it was just a wild coincidence or something more. It didn't help that I had this nagging thought in the back of my mind that we had made a mistake by picking him up in the first place. By the time we got in the car and started driving again, the mood was off. Jackson wasn't in the mood to talk, and neither was I. I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see Croy's face, but the road behind us was empty. It didn't stop me from glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, as if some part of me was still expecting him to pop up. We were back on the road, but it felt different now. It wasn't the carefree adventure we had planned. It had turned into something darker, something more unsettling. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, trying to focus. We passed through a few small towns. Some of them were just dots on the map, places you could easily miss if you blinked. There was a gas station here and there, but otherwise, it was just miles and miles of empty desert stretching out in front of us. The closer we got to the next big city, the more I began to feel like the trip had taken a wrong turn somewhere. It wasn't just about the places anymore. It was about the people we were meeting along the way. By the time we were about an hour outside the city, the unease had grown unbearable. Croy was still somewhere in my mind, and I couldn't push him out. He had been so calm, so collected at first. Then, without warning, he flipped. It was like he was on some sort of emotional roller coaster, one we weren't prepared for. And that moment when he threw the bottle at that other hitchhiker, the anger that had surged in him, so sudden and wild, left me questioning everything. Who was he really? What was he hiding beneath the surface? Jackson's voice cut through the silence. I'm telling you, we should have just left him back at that gas station. What if he comes back for revenge? His words hit me like a slap. I didn't want to admit it, but he was right. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how stupid it had been to pick him up in the first place. Maybe he won't, I said, but even I wasn't convinced. We pulled into the city later that evening, and the tension between us felt like it had reached its peak. The streets were busy, a stark contrast to the barren stretch of road we just come from. As we got closer to our hotel, I felt a bit of relief. It was like finally reaching an oasis after a long and dangerous journey. We parked the car, but before we could even head inside, Jackson turned to me with a serious look on his face. "What do we do if we see Croy again? Like really, what do we do?" I didn't have an answer. The truth was, I didn't know. I didn't know what Croy wanted from us, and I didn't know how to handle it if he showed up again. All I knew was that we needed to make it through this trip without him turning our adventure into something far worse. As the night wore on, the worry didn't go away. If anything, it grew. When I finally managed to sleep, my dreams were filled with strange images: Croy's face, twisted in anger, and the feeling of being trapped in some kind of maze I couldn't escape. The next day felt like a blur, the heaviness of what we had experienced pressing down on us like a thick fog. Jackson and I both kept our distance from one another, as if the space between us might somehow help ease the tension. I wanted to pretend that everything was fine, but the reality was I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being followed. Every time a car passed, I found myself glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Croy's face glaring back at me. We spent the morning in the city, trying to distract ourselves by visiting a few tourist spots. The usual distractions of road trip activities, eating overpriced diner food, posing for goofy pictures in front of roadside attractions, didn't offer the same kind of comfort they once had. It all felt hollow. Something about the city made it worse. The crowds, the noise, the constant hum of urban life. It didn't help me feel less exposed. By the afternoon, I was ready to leave, and Jackson agreed without much of a protest. We grabbed our bags from the hotel and loaded the car quickly, both of us aware that we hadn't fully unpacked in the first place. There was no need to linger. We couldn't get back on the road fast enough. But the city that we thought would offer relief seemed more like a trap. As we pulled out of the parking lot, I caught a glimpse of someone across the street, standing under the glow of a streetlight. The wind tousled his hair, and for a moment, I swore it was Croy. I stopped breathing for a second, my foot hovering above the gas pedal. But when I blinked, he was gone. "Dude, you okay?" Jackson asked, noticing the way I was staring ahead. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "Just thought I saw something." We drove in silence for a while, the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we weren't alone. It wasn't just about Croy. Something had shifted in the air, like an unsettling premonition that there was something bigger coming. I felt like I was walking toward it. No matter how far we went, it would eventually catch up. Then, as we were nearing the outskirts of town, something strange happened. A beat-up car pulled alongside us, the driver's window rolling down. It was just for a second, but the face I saw made my heart race. It was Croy. The car matched the one he'd been driving earlier, and the silhouette in the driver's seat was unmistakable. I could barely make out his features, but his eyes locked with mine for just long enough to make my stomach drop. "Floor it," I said urgently, not waiting for Jackson to ask why. Jackson didn't hesitate. His foot slammed on the gas pedal, and we sped up, the engine roaring to life beneath us. I didn't look back, but the creeping sensation of someone following us remained. The next few hours were a blur of fast food stops, small town highways, and the kind of dead air that can only come from a car full of nervous energy. It wasn't until we hit a stretch of road with no signs of life, just endless plains stretching out on either side, that the unease reached its peak. I couldn't take it anymore. "I think we need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. Jackson glanced over, his grip tightening on the wheel. "About what?" "About Croy," I said, feeling the words spill out before I could stop them. "What if we're making a mistake? What if he's dangerous?" "I don't know," Jackson replied slowly, eyes still focused on the road. "But what do we do? We can't just keep running." The truth was, I didn't have an answer. There was no clear course of action. But the thought of confronting him, of dealing with whatever madness was brewing, terrified me. The last time we saw him, he'd almost seemed like a different person, someone with a hidden rage that we didn't understand. I knew we couldn't go on like this forever. We need to find out what he really wants, I said, my voice shaking slightly. And we need to figure out if we can get away from him, for good. Jackson didn't say anything for a long time, but eventually he nodded. We'll figure it out. We always do. It felt like a long time before we saw anything familiar. I couldn't tell how much time had passed, but by the time we reached another small town, night had fallen and the streets were eerily quiet. As we pulled into a gas station, the feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong, even if the world seemed still on the outside. I stepped out of the car, hoping for a breath of fresh air, when I saw it. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. It was a shadow in the dimly lit lot, just beyond the reach of the streetlight. "Jackson," I whispered, but he was already at the door, oblivious. I turned to look again. My heart pounded in my chest. This time, I saw him clearly, Croy, standing under the flickering light of the gas station sign. He wasn't far. His gaze met mine across the lot, and I froze. "Shit," I muttered, barely above a whisper. I had no idea how long he had been there, or how long he had been watching. But I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over. We weren't running anymore. We were facing whatever Croy had in mind. Whatever he wanted from us, we were going to find out, whether we were ready or not. The cold wind bit at my skin as I stood frozen, staring at Croy, who hadn't moved a muscle. It felt like time had slowed down, the world around me fading into the background. He was too still, too composed, like a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Jackson finally turned around, following my gaze. His expression shifted, eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. Without saying a word, he reached for the keys in his pocket, his hand twitching toward the car door, but I stopped him. "Don't," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He's here." Jackson's face hardened, and he stepped out of the car slowly, his eyes darting between me and Croy. The silence between us stretched thin, suffocating. Croy didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge us beyond that unsettling stare. "What do you want?" I called out, my voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. Croy's lips curled into a slight smile, and he took a step toward us. His eyes glinted with something dark, something unreadable. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice low and calm, but there was a menace underneath. "I'm here because you need to hear the truth." Jackson stepped forward, ready for anything. "The truth," he scoffed. "The truth about what, exactly?" Croy tilted his head, as if considering Jackson's question. "About everything," he said, his gaze flickering between the two of us. "About why I've been following you, and why you're not safe." The chill in the air deepened as the wind howled around us. My heart beat faster, each word from Croy feeling like a ticking clock, counting down to something that could change everything. "You've been following us?" I asked, my voice cracking. "What do you want from us?" Croy's eyes softened, just for a moment. "It's not about what I want," he said, his voice quieter now. "It's about what's coming. The people you're running from, they're not just after you. They're after something much bigger. Something that could destroy everything." I looked at Jackson, both of us silently trying to process the weight of Croy's words. But the more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. Croy's sudden appearances, the strange coincidences, the nagging feeling that we were being watched. It all pointed to something more than just a personal vendetta. This was bigger than us. "What do you mean, something bigger?" Jackson asked, his voice tight with distrust. "What the hell are you talking about?" Croy didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced around the gas station lot, his eyes flicking to the shadows, as if he was waiting for someone or something. Then, with a sigh, he spoke again, this time with more urgency. "You're not the only ones caught in the crossfire," he said. "There are people, groups, pulling strings in the background. You think it's just me coming after you? You're wrong. There's a whole network, a hidden war. And you've both become targets because you're connected to something they need. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. What do they want? What are they after? Croy's expression grew more serious. A piece of technology, he said, lowering his voice. A weapon. A thing that could shift the balance of power. And they think you know where it is. The world seemed to tilt as everything crashed down on me. A weapon? Power? I had no idea what he was talking about, but I felt my pulse quicken as the pieces started to come together. The weird things happening. The constant feeling of being watched. I hadn't been paranoid. There was someone, hunting us. You think we know where it is? Jackson's voice cracked. How the hell would we know anything about that? Croy's eyes bored into mine. I don't think you know, he said softly, but you're connected to it. And if they think you have it, or if they think you know where it is, they'll stop at nothing to make you tell them. I could barely breathe as the weight of his words settled over me. This was no longer just a matter of surviving some stalker or evading a single person. It was about something much bigger. Something that had already drawn us into its orbit, and now there was no way out. You're saying we're in this because of some weapon? I asked, disbelief evident in my voice. And you're here to warn us? Croy nodded slowly. I'm here to help, but it's dangerous. They're not going to stop, and they'll use anyone, to get what they want. If you want to survive, you have to trust me. I didn't know what to believe. The situation was spiraling faster than I could comprehend. But one thing was clear, Croy wasn't here just to make our lives miserable. He was offering us a chance to escape the danger we were in, even if it meant trusting the last person I wanted to trust. We can't just take your word for it, Jackson said, stepping forward. You've been following us for God knows how long. Why should we trust you now? Croy's expression hardened. Because I'm the only one who knows how to get you out of this alive. There was a long pause, the tension palpable in the air. I glanced at Jackson, and without a word, we both understood. This was no longer a choice between running and hiding. This was a choice between confronting whatever nightmare we were caught in or continuing to run and praying it wouldn't catch up. Fine, I said, my voice steadying despite the fear coursing through me. Tell us what we need to do. Croy's face softened, just slightly. It's not going to be easy. But the first thing you need to understand is this: you're already marked. The only way out is to confront it head-on. As Croy spoke, I realized that we were standing on the precipice of something much darker than we had ever imagined. Whatever was, we had no choice but to face it, whether we were ready or not. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting back,